session.
There we go. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Welcome, welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, I think we are ready to get started. Allie, can I get our first slide, please? All right, good evening, welcome, and welcome to the RPM Next Phases Planning Study public meeting. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Tonight, our presentation focuses on the Chicago study area from Addison to Howard. The meeting on Thursday night will focus on the Purple Line in Evanston and Wilmette, and similar information will be shared at both meetings. I'd like to first take a moment and go over a few technical reminders. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the project website following the meeting, and we'll share that link in just a moment. Simultaneous interpretation in Spanish and ASL, as well as captioning, are available for this webinar. To listen in Spanish, you'll find the interpretation globe icon at the bottom menu of your Zoom screen. You'll click that right arrow, you'll choose Spanish and mute original audio. And then you can toggle back to the original audio if you need to. To enable closed captions, click the small arrow to the right of the CC icon and make your selection. ASL has been spotlighted for all participants. This meeting is a webinar, so chat has been disabled and attendees are muted. If you do have questions for the project team, please utilize the Q&A panel in the Zoom menu. You'll find that at the bottom menu bar of your screen. When you click Q&A, a panel will open where you can submit a question. We won't be able to answer all questions tonight, but we will have time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. In addition, following the webinar, we'll post frequently asked questions on the project website, along with a recording of this webinar. If you need technical support, please select Raise Hand, also in the menu, and someone from our project team will message you to troubleshoot. Outside of the webinar, you can send questions to the project team anytime. We'll include an email address and the project website in the chat in just a moment. The email address is rpmnextphases@transitchicago.com, and we'll include that URL, transitchicago.com/rpm/nextphases. During the webinar, we'll ask a few questions utilizing Zoom polls. When it's time for a question, I will launch the poll, which will pop up in your Zoom window. I'll read the question and then you'll submit your answer. Once all the answers are in, I will display the poll results. All right, I think I've got through all of the technical reminders. Thank you for your patience. Let's transition to the reason that you are all here tonight, to learn more about the Next Phases planning study. I'd like to introduce Leah Dawson-Mooney, Director of Strategic Planning and Policy at the Chicago Transit Authority, to kick us off with introductions.
Thanks so much, Marissa. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here tonight. Thank you for making the time to be here with us. We're really excited to be kicking off this first round of public meetings for the RPM Next Phases study with you guys tonight. As Marissa mentioned, I'm Leah Dawson-Mooney with CTA, And I also want to introduce some of the team members here tonight who will be presenting tonight. So Sonali Tandon, Christina Bader, both with CTA, Marissa Strassel, who you heard from already with Muse, and Jackie Murdoch with CDM Smith. We also have a few representatives from the RPM Phase 1 team here, and we have some project team members in the background that'll be helping out and providing support from CTA, from CDM Smith, and from Muse. So thanks again for your participation today. As Marissa said, we're here tonight to talk about how CTA is investing in the future of the red and purple lines. And at this meeting, what we really want to do is to share information on the RPM program overall, and also on this RPM Next Phases planning study. We want to discuss the study elements and the outcomes that we're looking for. We also want to share with you what our approach to engagement will be throughout this project. And finally, we hope to gather some feedback from you and hear from you during the Q&A session. We do understand and want to acknowledge that there may be some concerns about continuing impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. We encourage you to take a look at this Meeting the Moment report, the cover of which is actually shown on this slide. You can find that at the link that's going to be posted here in the chat. And I also wanted to say that there's a new scorecard that we have up that tracks how we're actually performing against these objectives. So feel free to take a look at that if you haven't seen it yet. Now I'm going to hand over to Sonali, and she's going to pull up the agenda and walk us through an overview. Sonali?
Thank you, Leah, and hello, everyone. I'm Sonali Tandon, and I work with Leah and Christina in CTA's Strategic Planning and Policy team. Today's agenda starts with reviewing the RPM program timeline. Then we'll review existing conditions of the red and purple lines, go over specific elements the study is covering, talk about outreach and engagement, and then finally wrap up with questions and answers. I'll hand it over to Marissa to introduce our first poll.
Thank you, Sonali. In just a moment, I will launch the poll. This is the first of 3 polls. Let me go ahead and launch that. So we're interested in hearing if you're a red line writer, a purple line writer, or if you use both. So I've launched that poll. I see numbers coming in. Numbers are still ticking up, so I'll just give everyone another moment. All right, I'm going to end the poll and launch the results. So it looks like we have a little mix of red line writers and writers that read both the red and the purple line. Thank you all for sharing. I'll pass it back over to Sonali for a project review.
So let's begin with an overview of the RPM Next Phases planning study. RPM Next Phases is part of CTA's Red Ahead program and is being completed at the same time as Phase 1 continues construction. RPM Next Phases focuses on 3 segments that are shown here on the map: Addison to Sheridan, Thorndale to Howard, Evanston branch, which is the purple line between Howard and Linton. The study does not cover existing RPM Phase 1 section from Lawrence to Bryn Mawr, the Wilson Station, and south of Addison. I mentioned that RPM is under the larger umbrella program of Red Ahead, which is a comprehensive initiative for modernizing and expanding Red Line, which is Chicago's most traveled rail line. There are 3 major improvement projects in the Red Ahead program: RPM, Red Line South reconstruction, and Red Line extension. There are also other projects that fill in the gaps, including the Wilson Station reconstruction, Clark Division Station renovation, and 95th Street terminal improvements, all of which have been completed. All these projects are mutually beneficial, as improvements in one area of the line can improve the speed, reliability, and capacity of the entire line. RPM corridor planning work started with a vision study for the entire 9.6-mile corridor from Belmont to Linden in 2009-2010 timeframe. We'll talk in the next slide about the results of that first visioning study, which continues to guide RPM planning efforts. In 2011 to 2013, following the vision study, CTA conducted an in-depth environmental review, which is required documentation to apply for federal funding. This also included extensive outreach and analysis on the impacts of the project, as well as conceptual designs for station and track improvements. Through this process, full modernization was identified as the preferred alternative. But because of the huge task of modernizing the whole corridor, it was decided to break up the RPM program in phases. The phase 1 project elements were identified and moved forward along with their own environmental review. The next phases study builds off this previous work and fills in the gaps, such as addressing the yards and terminals at Howard and Linden, and the transition between the phase 1 structure near Thorndale. Any improvements proposed in this study will need their own environmental review. This slide shows the RPM corridor vision goals from the 2010 visioning study for the whole corridor, which prioritized the public's preference for full modernization. Some of you on today's call may have been involved in this previous process in 2009 and 2010. The goals you see listed here are still in effect for the next phases study and include expanding capacity, which will reduce crowding, improving speed and reliability, making stations ADA accessible, and generally improving the customer experience as well as fostering economic development. As many of you know, CTA was successfully able to obtain the necessary local and federal funding for first phase of the RPM, and it is currently under construction. Phase 1 project elements were identified through earlier planning work, as discussed on one of the previous slides. The project has 2 main segments. One is just north of Belmont, the red-purple bypass, which removes turning conflicts between red, purple, and brown lines and thereby unlocks capacity by increasing the number of trains that can pass through the junction. The bypass is complete and has been in operation since 2021, and the team is currently completing related work in the area to upgrade track. The second main segment of phase 1 is the Lawrence to Bryn Mawr section, where 4 stations are being rebuilt. A completely new track structure is also being built between those stations, and you can see a photo of the overhead gantry on the slide that is being used to assemble the new structure. Additionally, there are behind-the-scenes improvements happening in phase 1, such as a new signal system from Belmont to Howard and power upgrades, which also help with unlocking the capacity. RPM Next Phases study is one of the first steps in preparing to pursue core capacity funding from the Federal Transit Administration. This is the source that will make federal funding a possibility for future modernization. It is the same program that CTA successfully pursued to fund part of phase 1 project. And a big requirement is that projects funded through the program increase capacity by at least 10% for each phase. Capacity is the ability of a transit line to move many people safely, efficiently, and comfortably. The grant specifies certain eligible project types, but we are looking at how we can take best advantage of this federal program to also upgrade outdated infrastructure as part of a package of project elements. We want to emphasize that the Next Phases study is planning for the next 100 years, not the current state. A lot has changed with the pandemic, but we know that ridership is recovering and red and purple lines will continue to be critical infrastructure for Chicago and the northern suburbs. Ridership and development trends show that we need to continue investing in RPM corridor, and we are addressing needs for decades to come with this study. At this point, I'll hand it over to Christina, who will walk you through the details of the Next Phases study.
Hey everyone, I'm Christina Bader, the project manager for the study with CTA Strategic Planning. I'll be walking you through our approach to this work, the timeline, the project elements we're looking at, and some of the constraints that we're up against with a legacy system like CTA when we undertake these kinds of projects. So to recap, we were always thinking about this work with the whole corridor in mind, even though the project magnitude required breaking the work into phases. Which brings us to RPM next phases. This is a planning study that picks up where phase 1 leaves off. The goal of this study is identifying improvement recommendations to address capacity constraints and infrastructure needs once phase 1 is complete. We'll also position CTA to apply for the significant amount of federal funding that will be required. Sonali shared a map of the entire RPM next phases study area earlier. Now we can talk through each segment. This zooms into the Evanston branch, which includes the area from Howard to Linden, the city of Evanston, and the village of Wilmette. It includes 8 local service Purple Line stations and the track down to Howard. Looking at ADA accommodations will be a critical part of considerations, since most of these stations are currently not fully accessible. The branch will also be getting a new signal system. The Thorndale to Howard segment is one of our 2 Chicago segments, and it includes the transition from phase 1, just south of Thorndale Station, to the terminal and yard at Howard. It runs through Rogers Park and Edgewater. Creating a more permanent connection from where phase 1 construction will leave off near Thorndale Station, and it is an example of an important project element in this section, in addition to making these stations fully accessible. The final Chicago segment starts north of where phase 1 is reconstructing track near Belmont Station through the Addison and Sheridan stations. This segment is in Lakeview, Buena Park, and Uptown. Sheridan Station has especially been on our radar for needing improvements for a long time, and we'll be evaluating options for it as part of the study. The infrastructure on these lines is a century old and in many cases requires complete reconstruction to bring it to modern standards and for CTA to be able to maintain it in the future. The viaduct in this image shows the type of infrastructure that we would be replacing. In the RPM phase 1 project area, these viaducts are being replaced with new bridges that span the street, removing columns from the middle of the roadway and improving both safety and community aesthetics. An important need is also ADA accessibility. This is a big priority for the CTA, and in most cases, ADA accessibility cannot be added to a station without modernization. For example, platforms need to be widened, station entrances need to be reconfigured, and additional life safety requirements for exiting need to be met. To bring the significant federal dollars that will be needed to RPM next phases, we're looking at how to make these upgrades eligible for the federal core capacity funding program. A big question on everyone's mind, I'm sure, is when will this work be done? To give an idea about the timeline of planning, funding, and construction, we overlaid a high-level timeline for phase 1 and the next phase, which we anticipate will follow similar planning, engineering, and funding processes. You can see here that visioning began for RPM in 2009-2010, with funding secured about 7 years later, and construction starting a few years after that. Construction is planned in phase 1 through 2025. These complex infrastructure projects take a lot of time and due diligence, which is why CTA is starting the next phase's planning process now, overlapping with phase 1 construction. There are several important steps after the study completion before any improvements would be realized. The timeline is highly dependent on the availability of federal funding. So this slide zooms in a little bit on the next phase's process. We are currently in the early planning stages. There are many additional steps needed before construction would begin, and these all take time and thoughtful planning. This includes additional planning and environmental review in coordination with local, regional, state, and federal agencies. Additionally, funding would need to be identified, applied for, and awarded for projects to begin any construction could occur. Stakeholder and public outreach will occur along the way. Our work to date in the ideation and discovery stage includes understanding current needs, identifying study elements, and launching our outreach and engagement. An important part of this work is also evaluating the best way to package project elements to meet that 10% capacity improvement requirement for core capacity funding. So that was some project history, overview of the study area, and our timeline. We're going to take a quick break here for another poll, and I'm going to hand it over to Marissa for that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christina. So for our second poll question, we're really interested in understanding what types of trips that you make taking the red and purple lines. I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll. So the options are for commuting, for appointments, shopping, entertainment, travel to or from the airport, or some other reason. So we'll give participants a moment to respond. Right now, it looks like entertainment and commuting are the top results, but I'll give participants another moment. Still see some results coming through. So it looks like I'm going to end the poll here and share the results with everyone. By the way, I did want to mention the polls are anonymous. So it looks like, as you can see, entertainment, certainly commuting, and just day-to-day appointments are some of the top results for this question. Thank you so much for your input. I also just wanted to note that for participants who have asked questions in the Q&A panel, our project team is reviewing each of those questions behind the scenes. And while we won't be able to answer all questions tonight, we will have time at the end of the presentation for the team to respond to those most frequently asked. And as I mentioned at the upfront, we will be posting frequently asked questions to the project website following this webinar. So with that, I will pass it back to Christina to walk us through existing conditions.
So before we get into what kind of improvements we'll be considering in our study, we want to share what conditions currently exist in the study area. This image shows Moore Station in the 1940s. In a lot of ways, things still look and are the same 80 years later. With the exception of a few stations, the red and purple line stations and track structures in the study area are around 100 years old. Most stations need complete reconstruction, lessen maintenance issues, provide riders with modern amenities, and be more accessible. Much of the station infrastructure is at the end of its useful lifespan. As mentioned earlier, the red line is the busiest in the system, traveling through some of the most dense transit-friendly neighborhoods in Chicago. From 2000 to 2019, 65% of red line stations and 70% of purple line stations experienced ridership growth, with many showing significant growth. So now we'll take a look at our approach to project elements and outcomes. Here you can see some of the project elements we're considering. Some of them aren't as apparent to riders as they are to the engineers on our team. They have big impacts in terms of modernizing conditions and helping CTA reach the needed 10% capacity improvement. Howard and Linden yards are at storage capacity, and we're looking at ways to relieve the pressures on them. Terminals at these stations, particularly at Howard, have complex operational train movements as trains move in and out of the yard that often cause delays on the red, purple, and yellow lines. At stations, we'll be modernizing and providing ADA accessibility. Future 10-car service on the red line and 8-car service on the purple line are being considered with the necessary platform extensions. In fact, improving accessibility is one of the main objectives of RPM. CTA has a program to make the remaining non-accessible rail stations fully ADA compliant called the All Stations Accessibility Program, or ASAP. RPM is the program that will complete this goal in its footprint by rebuilding the remaining stations as accessible. Behind the scenes elements include the signal system, how the trains communicate with each other for safe operations, factors that influence speed such as curves and track conditions, and traction power availability, which is what gives the trains the power they need to travel. Signals are being fully replaced between Belmont and Howard as part of phase 1, but the existing signal system on the purple line is from the 1970s and is one of the oldest remaining on the system. Ultimately, the study will recommend a package of improvements of these elements that best utilizes the core capacity funding program. So the Wilson Station reconstruction project in Uptown is a previous Red Ahead project completed in 2017 that can serve as an example of the kind of modernization improvements that can result from the RPM investment. I just want to note that this isn't a perfect apples to apples example of potential next phases improvements. Improvements identified through the study will be unique to each station, taking into consideration community feedback and engineering constraints for each location. There are many station improvements from the outside of the station and while entering that are called out on the slide, including sound barriers to buffer train noise, an open street crossing clear of obstructive columns, a new secondary entrance, and escalators and elevators to access the platform. The Wilson Station project also included many improvements at the platform level. Overall, the platforms are covered from the elements with wide clearances to walk or use a wheelchair. There are also elevators for each platform. The 2 platforms are long enough for 10-car trains, which may be something CTA adopts in the future on the Red Line. For all project elements, there are a variety of constraints when planning for modernization that we're working with, coming from the surrounding environment, train operation requirements, and historic elements. A couple examples are shown here. Howard Station operations could improve to support faster travel times, reduce bottlenecks, and add capacity, but it's the only place in the CTA system where 3 lines terminate, so managing this is a challenge. Also, the station is adjacent to multiple historically significant buildings, which limits some of our options. We're currently analyzing what options exist to streamline operations while balancing a limited footprint to fit the neighborhood context. Sheridan Station, with the footprint available and track configuration, there's no room to add elevators and widen platforms, which are needed to make the station ADA accessible. Also, the physical condition of the station makes upgrades challenging. Full reconstruction is necessary to make it accessible to all users. This is the case for most stations, which necessitate full rebuilds. The curve that surrounds the station platform slows down train speeds, but there are also very limited options to improve this because CTA only owns the land where the tracks and station currently sit. There's both old and new development that makes straightening the curve challenging. We're looking at all options here, which includes station location. The upcoming work of the study will be to develop design alternatives for stations and other infrastructure that address these constraints while still meeting the vision goals. So thanks everyone. I know we covered a lot of ground there. I'm gonna pass it back to Marissa from Muse, our consultant leading the public and stakeholder engagement.
Excellent, thank you, Christina. So yeah, I am Marissa Strassel. You've been seeing me a bit tonight. I am part of the project team from Muse Community Design, working on the engagement and outreach for this next phases planning study. Yes, you've heard a lot of information tonight. We'd like to just share a little bit about how we'll be continuing to engage with all of you and gathering feedback throughout this project study. After I go through just a couple of slides, we'll launch one final poll, and then we'll move on to Q&A. So the goal with our engagement is really kind of twofold. We want to create opportunities for gathering general feedback, and then we want to gather specific feedback on project elements. Those are things like station modernization and signal improvements. For our engagement, we have several touch points. They include some stakeholder meetings that we held a few months ago with leaders and organizations within the study area. We have these virtual public meetings. We have one this evening and another one on Thursday as an opportunity to provide an overview of the project study to the general public. As you know, we promoted these meetings through several channels, including aldermanic offices, social media, CTA displays, ads, and through Ventra. Paired with this public meeting, we've launched a survey which will be open through March 27th. I'll share that link in just a moment. And to date, we've received over 300 responses to that survey. In addition, we have a project page on the CTA website where we'll be sharing regular updates. We're planning for a second round of engagement this fall. And during that engagement, we hope to include both virtual and in-person activities during that next round. So how will we use this information? Things that we're hearing in these meetings, in our stakeholder meeting, and in the survey. So all of your input paired with the technical analysis will inform potential study element improvements. And we'll certainly be keeping you informed along the way. Now we'll launch our final poll. For this question, we'd like to know which outcomes are the most important for you. Keep in mind, as part of the modernization plan, CTA is working to make all stations accessible. With that in mind, in addition to accessibility improvements like elevators and escalators, which features and amenities would most improve your station experience? Just before I launch this poll, I will note this poll does allow for multiple selections. We ask that you do keep it to 2 choices. So I'll launch this poll now. Again, which 2 outcomes are the most important to you? Reliability, speed, frequency, transfer points, pedestrian access, or bus to rail connections? Seeing results come in, it looks like frequency and reliability are top responses so far. We'll give folks another moment. All right, I'll share out the results now. Looks like reliability and frequency, followed by speed, transfer points, pedestrian access, and bus to rail connections. Thank you all for taking a moment to answer. Next, we're going to transition a little bit, and I'm going to hand it over to Jackie Murdoch with CDM Smith to lead our Q&A section. As a reminder, we won't be able to answer all questions, but following the webinar, we will be posting frequently asked questions on the project website, along with a recording of this webinar. So with that, I will hand it over to Jackie. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marissa. And thank you everyone for an active Q&A session. And we're just gathering them in here and going to be again, sort of calling out a few to answer out loud. The first one I'm going to start with is just a few questions on what is sort of inbounds for this study. And we'll start with, will this program make any upgrades to the track or structure between Sheridan and Wilson? So I'm just going to kick that over to you, Leah, to kind of clarify again the extent of our study and make sure everyone's clear about the track improvements that are outside of just the station improvements.
Thanks, Jackie. Yes, that's a great question. So when we talk about these segments, we're using the station names, but it is our intention to fully upgrade the infrastructure, structure, track, and other elements that are between the stations and then connecting. So at Sheridan, we would be working on the structure all the way through to where that new structure is in place south of Wilson Station, somewhere around Montrose.
Great, thank you. A few actually questions coming in about questions about Purple Line transfers. So we have, and this is gonna be a two-parter. One is, will a Purple Line transfer at Loyola or Granville be considered? We know that's been in the mix for a while, so we'll get to that question. Second part of that is another sort of Purple Line platform question. Will northbound Purple Line platforms south of Howard be considered?
Do you have a specified answer person, Jackie? Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, Leah, back to you.
Sure. Just dive right in. So great questions on the Purple Line transfers. In the vision study for RPM that we initially did, we actually looked at a Purple Line transfer at Loyola. So we could look at that again, but I think looking at a number of different locations makes sense at this phase in the study. The other thing I would note is that we did add that at Wilson. I think with RPM phase 1 underway, some of the routing has not made it always possible for all the platforms to be used that way, but it is the intention to have that two platform special stop for the Purple Line there at Wilson, and that really allows people to use those services more interchangeably. In terms of Howard, there were actually a few questions that we saw on Howard Station in the chat. Really good questions. We've also been looking at that, and I think we'll be considering some concepts for how to untangle some of that and look at how to streamline service provision. It is challenging to have a single terminal with 3 different services, and thinking about how they share tracks and share platforms, and then do these different moves there. I guess I would ask my teammates if you want to add anything to that answer. I think I covered it. They're not unmuting, so I guess they think I covered it. If anybody doesn't think I covered it, feel free to ask more in the chat. But yes, we are looking certainly at how Howard Terminal specifically is configured and functions.
Yeah, and just a little flavor of that as a more detailed Howard question, kind of building on that. Someone mentioned in the chat, many times a northbound red line train has to arrive at the southbound platform, and it creates a problem for switching right between services like the northbound yellow and purple. So can Howard Station be improved, right, to minimize these sort of wrong platform arrivals? And I think you sort of answered that, right? We're sort of re-rationalizing, looking at Howard, but anything else, Leah, that comes to mind after that question?
I will say that one of the challenges that we have all throughout this built environment is just the level of density and the space that we have to work within. So when you think about, a greenfield project versus a reconstruction project, you do have to think about how you actually phase this and make it, usable and keep service going during construction, something that's been happening already on RPM phase 1 and elsewhere, but also thinking about how we actually build within the space that we have available and how we create that set of tracks and switches and ways that tracks can maneuver between tracks and create enough flexibility, but also sort of rationalize that setup.
So speaking of construction, we have another question here. And again, I think I'm going to hit to Leah. During the construction of the Sheridan line in 2025, how will people who rely on the train commute? Will there be a replacement train station?
One of the things that has been helpful about doing work in the RPM phase 1 corridor is having those 4 tracks to work with and being able to have work happening on half of the structure and track and then switching over to do the other half. It sounds easier than it actually is. I'm sure the RPM phase 1 team would tell me, but that does make it possible to keep running service, which is key. These are important lines, obviously. And then we have also, through the RPM phase 1 project, put in temporary stations that have allowed for that connectivity while the other stations are under construction. So I think that is one of the ways to sort of tackle that problem.
Also, I just wanted to clarify, 2025 is when the phase 1 construction is scheduled to be completed. It's not when Sheridan Station would be under construction. That would be still several years out.
Thanks, Christina.
Great, thanks for clarifying. Okay, so another question here. As the next phase of studies are being conducted, and it's one study, so I'll clarify that off the bat, will the sort of last mile problem be accounted for by providing increased bike and scooter parking in addition to bus route integration for all stations? So, you know, Leah, I'm going to kick that to you a little bit as we think about, again, sort of a multimodal universe and accessibility to stations. And maybe you can provide a little clarity on how we're thinking about that or not under this study.
One of the things that we do work on as part of these station projects or larger long-range planning projects is thinking about that multimodal environment, thinking about bus connections that are being made, thinking about, sorry, I got a phone call, thinking about, you know, opportunities for bike and how things interact with the bike network. And as well, we do have typically the bike racks and places to store your bikes, but also the way that CDOT positions their divvy stations around the city. And in fact, they did prioritize that at first. So I do think that that a multimodal environment is an important thing to look at. So thanks for weighing in on that. Sonali or Christina, do you guys have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I'll just add that. So that is, we'll definitely be looking at that, but that is also further down the line once we have moved forward in this RPM next phases planning study and figured out our plan and the what we are doing here.
Great. All right, another question for you, Leah, and then I'm going to kick it to Sonali for a sort of ADA accommodations questions here that we're getting in the Q&A. So it's going to be on ridership, and I know that's been something sort of top of mind for CTA in general, and certainly for the planning team here as we're looking at ridership estimates as a part of the sort of formal federal grant process here. But the question is, what is the outlook for ridership over the next 2 to 3 years, and how does that outlook affect the timeline being discussed today, if at all? That's to you, Leah.
That's a great question. I do have my crystal ball handy. Just kidding. We have seen, obviously, that there are some pretty significant changes that seem to be somewhat permanent in terms of people's commuting habits and patterns. Being able to work from home is something that people, many people that can, are continuing to do, and that has affected our commuting. At the same time, we've also seen people return to work more as well. And I think the other piece of this is how people are using transit for those other types of trips, whether it's errands or recreation, something else. I think in terms of this project and its timeline, my hope is that it would not influence that significantly. And here are some of the reasons why. First, this is happening across the country. And I think the understanding that it is still important to have a transit system, invest in your transit system, make that system available to people as an alternative to driving, and then just for general connectivity and equity. I think people understand that broadly and nationally, and I think the Federal Transit Administration that is writing the rules for how this stuff works understands that as well and is taking that into consideration. And the other thing I would add is just that although there are things that are uncertain about the future, there are a lot of people working hard to figure out how to create a sustainable transportation funding environment in the future, really to make sure that we're not dependent on what has historically been a very stringent, what we call fair recovery ratio, meaning historically we have required the transit agencies in this region to actually fund more of their operations through fares and other operating, other revenue that we earn, actually more so than a lot of other places across the country. And when you have a big drop off in ridership, that does make it harder to sustain operations. So we do have to think about how we maintain a sustainable operations environment while we're doing these major projects and investing in our system.
Great, thanks, Leah. So Sonali, I'm going to tee you up for sort of, again, like ADA question, and then I'm going to hit some funding questions, which Leah and Sonali, I'll have you tag team those. So Sonali, I'm wondering if you can help us answer and just maybe speak to a little bit generally how we're considering ADA as part of our station improvements. But this question specifically says, would already accessible stations at Loyola and Granville be under consideration for reconstruction to facilitate the repair of the track structure?
Yeah, so overall, CTA did a strategic plan called All Stations Accessibility Program that looks at making all the remaining stations accessible that are currently not accessible. And that plan also looks at the RPM program at making stations in the RPM corridor accessible. So, so the idea is that as part of the RPM program, all stations will be made accessible. And yes, we'll be looking at all stations in the RPM corridor, even though if they are currently accessible, because of the structure and other improvements, they could be impacted.
Great, thank you, Sonali. So some funding questions, and this is again going to go to Leah and Sonali. And I think just general theme here of questions coming in on the chat is, how is this project going to be paid for, right? Is it federal, state grants? Is there an estimate of how much this is going to cost? Sort of, ideas for if it's going to use specifically bipartisan infrastructure law, right? Just federal grant sources. So if you guys could speak a little bit generally about the sort of funding or ideas for funding for this project, and obviously we can reference how RPM Phase 1 tapped into different funding sources here.
So Leah, I can start and then you can pull in. So funding is definitely a big piece that we have to figure out in order to make this project a reality. And we hope to utilize, as I mentioned on my slides, we hope to utilize the CIG funding, the capital investment grant funding from FTA for core capacity projects. So, but that would only provide a portion of the funding that's needed here. So we'll have to look for local sources of funding, which could include state funding and transit tip funding. But the whole funding pieces have to be figured out more once we know the project that we are planning to build. That will be part of our planning study here and will continue to be refined and discussed as we move forward in the project over the next phases. Leah, do you want to add?
I can add to that. Sure, I can add to that I think, part of what we are doing with this project is looking at how to position this for major federal funding. A project of the magnitude of a reconstruction of a rail line like this would require that type of significant federal input, funding input. So thinking about how to make these projects eligible and fundable under that funding source is important. And as Sonali said, we have to come up with a local share too. Typically, they don't fund more than about half of the project, and the maximum is about 60% from a project program like the Core Capacity Project or program that's funding RPM Phase 1. I guess the other sort of thing to think about is just that in terms of the cost estimating piece of this, you really have to do a bit more scoping and then design. And I think Christina put up talks through a nice slide on timeline and the different steps that we go through in a major project like this. So after we sort of identify which are the project phases that we're going to execute, then we have to take that next phase forward into more preliminary engineering. And through that phase, you can do a solid cost estimate and get at how it's going to be built and make some assumptions that are critical for actually having a solid cost estimate.
All right, thank you. Funding. Everybody wants to know where's the money. Another sort of clarification question on timeline, which we did have a slide right on sort of the overall timeline process, not just for this study, but sort of how long these things generally take. And we kind of used RPM phase 1 as an example of, again, sort of the duration from going from something like planning to, seeing something in the ground. But I wonder, Christina, if you could just do a little clarification of RPM next phase's study timeline and just the overall timeline here for next phase's work.
Sure. So yeah, there's a lot of RPM acronyms getting thrown around, a lot of planning, RPM next phases planning study. It's just, we can clarify all those things. So we are in the RPM next phases planning study. Our plans should wrap up towards the end of the year, maybe going into next year a little bit. And then once we know which project elements we're pursuing further, as Leah mentioned, we would then start the next phase of the process, which would be the more planning and engineering in our environmental NEPA process. And then just to take it back, RPM phase 1 is under construction right now, and that construction process will be ongoing through 2025.
Thanks, Christina. And I think definitely ties back to that earlier question on funding, right, in terms of when these sort of next phases work will sort of be in the ground. Really, a lot of that does depend on this sort of funding mixture that CTA is working on making a reality. So another question I'm going to ask generally, a lot of questions about property acquisitions, demolishing buildings, mostly, in the context of, that's what occurred in RPM phase 1. And Leah, you kind of alluded to that when you were speaking about how we're sort of working within a tight footprint with a built environment. And, we're taking an early look at how all of our concepts would affect right of way. So any sort of general recap, right, of where we are in the planning process in terms of understanding building impacts or any acquisitions at this point?
It's very early in the process. So I would just say, don't rush to judgment. We have certainly not made any decisions or even really looked at that very much at this point. I think there is a process in place for any project like this, guided by the Federal Uniform Relocation and the URA Act. And so I would just say that there are protections in place for anybody that could be impacted by this in the future, including a very long notification period that happens throughout what is called the National Environmental Policy Act process. So the NEPA process requires disclosure of a number of different elements of the project, including any potential impacts, and displacement impacts is one of those. So for example, on the Red Line Extension project that we're working on, we first started talking about displacement impacts in 2016, when the project planning had been underway for a number of years at that point. And properties did not start to be acquired really until this year, late last year, but this year. So that's a number of years. So I don't want people to feel like this is something that, have to be worried about at this point.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, there'll be enough opportunities and a lot of disclosure way in advance, and you will have notice, and we'll definitely be talking to you more in coming years as we move through the NEPA process and doing the environmental work. And for anyone whose property might be impacted, there'll be one-on-one coordination. So you'll be directly hearing from us if that is the case. But that is, as Leah said, that is further out at this point.
And I would also just add that we do look to minimize that as much as possible, right? And that's something that is also kind of a focus of doing these concepts, is looking at how to minimize that kind of impact. And for example, on the vision study, that was how we went from kind of a more standard, wider platform to actually in what was recommended for the Red Purple modernization program was actually a narrower platform, still wider than what you saw originally, right, from the 1920s infrastructure, but narrower than what you might see in other places, so that it could fit within that existing footprint and over the alley, spanning over the alley. And that really is how we addressed avoiding displacements in a lot of locations. So we do look to minimize that.
Excellent. Well, a couple of just sort of things that I wanted to note before we close out the Q&A. We did note that someone has a raised hand. We have taken note of you. You'll be getting a call tomorrow so we can hear your question. And so that can sort of be incorporated in our question set here. So apologies that we weren't able to get to your raised hand. We have also noted several RPM phase 1 questions. Again, phase 1 is sort of what is being actively constructed right now. We are in coordination with the RPM phase 1 team. We will be sending those questions that we got here today to the RPM phase 1 team, so we can, again, your feedback will be getting to the appropriate team here. And again, just thank you all for these great questions. As a reminder, we're going to be posting these frequently asked questions and answers on the project website, which you can find in the chat. Our colleagues have posted that project website in the chat, along with a recording of this webinar that you can also see again posted to that website. And from there, I'm going to hand it back to you, Leah, to close us out.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, for your time today. We really appreciate all of the time and engagement and questions. We will be looking to create some additional ways to answer those questions if we didn't get to them tonight. So as we wrap up, I just wanted to emphasize a few ways to keep in touch. You can visit us. Our project website is listed here, transitchicago.com/RPM/next-phases. You can send us an email. We do have a project email. You can follow us on social media. We would love it if you wanted to take our survey, and you can access that. That's not the same questions that you were asked tonight, just to be clear. New questions, separate survey, another opportunity to give us some input. And so you can access that on the Next Phases project page. So on behalf of all of us, the full project team, I just want to thank you for your time tonight, and look forward to communicating with all of you in the future, and have a great evening.